It's always a pleasure to be here with you. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the African Podcast TV. This podcast is about Africa regarding the political side, the historical side, the cultural side, and so many more. Each week, I deliver my best thought and analysis regarding Africa. Here, your host, Amaduba. Today, I have a special guest with me here. Join me to welcome Miss Arvy Nahar. She's a contractor specialist in the energy sector, and she's an associate editor, oil and gas operation African Leadership Group, and Miss Arvy is a board advisor, energy sector, Liberian Chamber of Commerce, and Mrs. Arvy is a critically acclaimed and spent her time between London and West Africa. Thank you so much for joining me this week on Africa View Deba.
Thank you so much, Amadou. It's an absolute pleasure. Appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Miss Arvy, could you give us an overview of your modus operandi and job specified? What were the inspiration to join the oil and gas industry?
Sure. Well, I'm a contract specialist in the oil and gas industry. I started in the industry at quite a young age, at 20 years old. I was studying for my law degree whilst working for BP. And I think the most attractive thing for me at that time was the actual the globalization of the industry and the ability to travel was very attractive. And when you're young, it's very nice to know that one day you could be in London, and the next day you could be in South Africa, and the next day you could be in the US.
Yes.
So that was the most attractive package for me. So I decided to stay within industry, and to date, I've been very fortunate with my level of exposure internationally. I've, very happy and satisfied.
Okay, sounds interesting. Okay, well, so the world is grappling with low oil prices. Now, as a contractor specialist in the oil and gas industry, did you forecast the fall in prices across the energy sector during the last quarter of last year?
I think it's very important to stress the fact that oil and gas price, this is not, I mean, a lot of it will be COVID related when we discuss the industry, but let's talk about the last 3 to 5 years. The industry's been very volatile, and we as contract specialists working for sometimes upstream and downstream sectors, we're very operational. So our opportunities and what we envisage, what we see as specialists, perhaps is not what happens in the marketplace. We're operational people, we're commercial people. So really, global trends predict what we put together as contracts teams. So if there's volatility in the political sphere in China, definitely that will affect what we do in the African continent and how we put together production sharing agreements and contracts when we go to the marketplace. So I think in answer to your question, nobody really knows. Our industry is so volatile, nobody can really pinpoint if the oil price will be a plus or a minus. And this is something that I think bankers as well as operational people and large CEOs of companies have battled with for the last couple of years. So yeah, I think we're at a stage right now in industry whereby obviously the global pandemic has had its toll on everybody. Everybody in the whole world has been affected. It's not a unique situation in the African subcontinent, but I am optimistic that the low-hanging fruit right now that operators and IOCs were looking at will come to fruition by kind of Q1 of next year. I believe things will get a bit better.
Sounds really interesting. I'm talking about you just talk about China. So what do you think about the relationship between China and Africa in the energy sector?
So I think we have to understand that China is not a new relationship with China and the African continent. And I think that the political instability globally, not just China. I know the focus is on China because they are one of the major partners for, from north to south, Chinese funding is also readily available. So I think it's always been a very tension-related partnership. And I think a lot of that got to do with instability in our industry. It may not be the political relationship that's the issue. It may be the volatility of the oil and gas price, or pricing of equipment, steel price. It could be varied things. I think put pressure on political policy as well. So I think it's always. I've read a lot of reports where people are very quick to say, "Oh well, China is the issue, and the Chinese funding and the loans." But the truth of the matter is that you've got to look at what's happening globally, and these relationships, a lot of pressure put on political relationships to then emphasize the way we implement policy in country. So I think the relationship has got better due to a lot of policies supporting Chinese businesses in Africa. Yeah.
Well, okay. With regard with regard to the energy and mining, what effect will the newly implemented African Continent Free Trade Agreement have on Africa trade potential?
I think this is, in my terms, I call it revolutionary. You've got a continent that can now, it is what it says, what it does on the package. It's free trade, free movement. That can only be a positive for any continent. And I believe that when you're able to trade from the north to the south of Africa, with limitations on fees for duties and taxes and import and export of revenues, I think that can only be a very positive thing for the continent. What it does, it emphasizes the integration of businesses. So, for example, if a trading company in North Africa, Morocco, for example, that want to engage and do some business in West or South Africa, it's easier. Even with regards to logistics, it will have an impact on logistics as well. So I think we're at a pivotal point in industry, just on a business sector, perhaps not so much the energy sector, but the continental agreement will definitely. It will change the way the world trades as well. It will emphasize inefficiencies as well as efficiencies, the way we trade from Europe into Africa as well.
So, in your view, in your knowledge, what do you think about the trade Africa? Like how it is? How do you think so? They should do something much better than what they are doing right now.
I think it's about global transparency. I think this is something that I think is not. I don't think we put enough emphasis on what my neighbor is doing. How can I support my neighbor? How can I support their trade agreements? How can I facilitate transactions and also benefit from it? And it's about the free movement of people as well. It's about scope of work. It's about movement of people. It's about skill set. It's about sharing knowledge as well. So for me, I'm very optimistic whereby the sharing piece, the sharing element of the agreement. I think it's about understanding that there's so much I think that we perhaps miss, even though we're in the sphere of everybody could Google everything now and have a knowledge base of anything you want to know. But I think that you have to understand that I've been based in I lived in Ghana for many years, and I remember just going to be based in Abuasi and going to another town. The way they do business is totally different. Totally different. So I think, imagine if I've experienced it from town to town to now understand that with the agreement, you're able to ascertain what another country is doing, what another African country is doing. And I think it's very important that now is the time that we have the transparency to actually share knowledge.
Well, okay. What do you believe are the most significant advances in technology in the energy sector in the past year, and how could they affect businesses?
I think I recently spoke about this on an interview, and I believe that we the African continent right now is preparing for what we call the fourth industrial revolution. You know, this part of the world is called the final frontier for a reason, and that is because, you know, you've got the e-commerce sector, you've got fintech, and you've also got just the chain of command of how to do business has changed, because online presence has become so apparent. So I think that the business development side of things for energy companies is to consider how small SMEs, subcontractors can actually support the large companies, and how they can support them is to perhaps educate them and give them some knowledge about how e-commerce and how to perhaps conduct online businesses and transactions. I mean, you know, we mustn't lose sight of the fact that right now, especially because we've been in lockdown, the whole world's been in a complete transition for the last 6 months. Online presence right now is of great importance. You know, you must have an online presence. So I think the development of e-commerce and fintech and all the relevant support networks will help businesses moving forward.
Mhm. Talking about online businesses, e-commerce. So how do you see Africa regarding the e-commerce, especially at this moment with the pandemic? And I don't want to see something like that. But in case if something like this happen, how Africa will take care of some businesses?
I think what we have to ascertain is that with a very vast, young, bright population, okay, the e-commerce sector and the level of development happening in country, it's only right that the younger population and the generation coming up can support local businesses. And this ties into another question regarding local content. So when a small company entity wants to operate in country, it gives the local workforce an opportunity to support any large corporation entering the region in the African continent. So that may be the administration support, account facilities, or anything to do with admin services. I don't know if you want to put it under that umbrella, but the support coming from the e-commerce sector is critical for any company wanting to aspire in the region.
Mhm. Let's talk about politics a little bit. Those political turbulence and regional stability determine the type of investment opportunities promoted for the African continent. Because we do understand that political instability that's not really good for the continent and for the businesses. So, what do you think about that in the energy sector?
I think we have to be careful, and I've answered this question before. I
Mhm.
think political instability is not unique or exclusive to the African continent.
Mhm.
Yes, the media put a lot of emphasis on these issues, but really, globally, there's levels of corruption everywhere. You
Mhm.
know, it's just how we manage it, how we mitigate these situations and scenarios. So I think that when global policy and business policy has changed so much in the last 10 years, that I think now, in order to do business smoothly and swiftly, it's now easier than ever. And I'd like to emphasize the fact that, you know, there was an implementation of a model whereby the NNPC in Nigeria very recently, for the sake of smooth transition and transparency, you know, they've taken a very bold step to issue their accounting figures online. So again, a lot of corporations, businesses, especially in country oil and gas related companies, willing and able to share the level of transparency in country. And I think that influences policy, you know, because you can't then have a scenario whereby people say that you've not engaged with us, you've not communicated, you've not shown us what's really going on. So I think, you know, level transparency, corporations acting responsibly, it also helps implementation of policy.
Mhm. Okay, perfect. So, please, can you explain to us the opportunities and then the challenges that are facing Africa regarding the energy sector?
So the challenges for me are what I can see, and my personal opinion are the global challenges right now. Financing for large oil and gas projects perhaps has stalled a little bit because of the pandemic. However, what it has done is it's given a great opportunity this time in lockdown for large companies, I mean, any company actually, to sit down and actually review strategy. And that's always a great opportunity for when you're going for the big business. And it may be for E&P, exploration and production contracts, or small drilling contracts. So I think the positives for me are the fact that it's now given us time to review both low hanging as well as the most lucrative deals as well.
Mhm.
Saying that, financing and the flow of finance into the African continent might be a bit slower than usual. And that again has got a lot to do with perhaps political instability and the relationship with China and India. So really global spheres, global issues that may affect the African continent.
Talking about, you just talk about, said that about India and people who don't know the relationship between Africa and India. Can you explain to those people exactly in the energy sector or some sector, please?
Sure. I mean, the relationship between India and the African continent is, we go back hundreds of
Mhm.
years. This is, when we were
Yeah.
colonized and the pre-movement of people. So this goes back very, very many years. So really, the relationship between India and the African continent, I think over the last 20 years has escalated because the Chinese development, I mean, this is a very new relationship, I believe, anyway, my personal experience being in Ghana. Whereas the Indian political relationship between Africa is much, I think is much stronger purely because of the many years Indians have been operating in the African continent. And that, did start with movement of people of when Indians were, especially, so let me talk about perhaps not the Francophone countries, but, the British influences.
Mhm.
So, a lot of Indians were brought over for fourth, fifth generations to Kenya, to Uganda, all over the world, South Africa, to work as on the fields and migrant workers. And now, obviously, generations ongoing, they call themselves Africans. So they're very particular of how they're addressed as people. Many of them go, some of them say we're Indian African, some of them just say no, we're African, because of the diverse workforce and the diverse communities in the regions as well.
So, how the African country will manage so the African people will benefit from the energy sector?
So I think this question leads me to the local content policy that needs to be discussed at quite a length, and that's because when the benefits of any company, oil and energy company in particular, come into a region to operate, it's actually a prerequisite for a company entering the region that they would consider a local content model. So this local content model, for those who don't actually understand what local content is, the definition
Mhm.
support the local workforce for when large companies do enter the region. So this local content policy is implemented into contracts. So a perfect example would be if a large company from Europe wants to come into an African country and they want to operate and work, part of the workforce, the skill sets would have to have some sort of local content component, and that's got a lot to do with ties into CSR, corporate social responsibility, on behalf of the company. So that may be education, that may be implementing certain provisions for local contractors and service companies to get involved in what's going on in their country. I think it's very challenging sometimes when you go into a very remote region and it's sometimes we see all these foreigners working, and
Mhm.
locally local workforce want to be involved. They want to understand what's going on. They want, as we say here in London, they want a piece of the action. So local content also it emphasizes and supports them. It supports their objectives to do business. So local content is very important, and it's something that we ensure is implemented in all our contracts.
Mhm. Perfect. So let's talk about the effect a little bit. What are some of the effect of oil and gas exploration in Africa?
I think the effects are both positive and negative. I think sometimes the development side of things perhaps can. It's very difficult, this question, because for me, I always see the positive, because the negative could be you work in any part of the world. And I think sometimes the way you actually engage with local government and implement local policy, sometimes that can be a challenge.
Mhm.
And I say that because, like with every unique country in the continent, you have legislation and policy that needs to be implemented and understood. Now, you can have the best lawyers and the best legal minds in the world sometimes, but put that aside, operational and transactory is a very different model. And I find sometimes the challenges of the two sometimes can be very difficult, because you're trying to administer a complete development scope, and on the other hand, you may not completely ascertain and understand the local law. I give you an example. I had a small mining had some small mining acreage in Ghana. Now, mining law, mining land is very different to agricultural law. So, for example, when you obtain a mining license in West Africa, in Ghana, you've also got to get certain district licenses for the water. You've also got to have a registration at the mining precious minerals and minings committee. So again, there are so many internal domestic issues and policies and legislation that you must follow, that sometimes if you're unaware of really what you're supposed to do, and to keep yourself aligned with your business objectives, you have to know that it's always going to be a challenge, because effectively you have to understand a new working model of doing business.
Mhm. So let me follow up to that question, and I understand you're making a good point. But just let's think about the local people who live in the area where the mining, where the energy sector are based. So some people they have very different life is better than some people who live in the city or somewhere. So what do you think about that?
I think the differences are very apparent. You see that, you see that here in London, for those that live in the city and those that live out of the city. And the same when you go to Africa, the African continent. I mean, in particular, I could talk about Nigeria. So I spent some time in Nigeria, and I've noticed that even when you step outside the outskirts of Abuja, hustling, bustling city, the way people interact with you is very different. Me going in as a foreigner, sometimes for me, it's very interesting to understand how people interact with you. I think it happens takes I think a long systematic kind of challenge in culture.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that is that it's a cultural change.
Mm-hmm.
You know, many people in local villages, anywhere globally, may not have come across somebody that looks like me. That's the truth,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really about you as a person, and when you go to operate and work in any remote region, it's how you actually integrate yourself within a model. And I think culturally, I mean, I find that it's about adapting to your environment. So I think, yes, there are differences between people that live in the city and live in the village, but to emphasize, one is not better than the other. Everybody has their own unique way of life.
Yeah, I'm just trying to see how the energy sector will affect those people who live in the local area. That, like you said, in Nigeria, we know that Nigeria is one of the country in Africa that has more oil or gases. So, and how the government will make sure to affect those people in the local area.
I think what we need to understand is locally, must take into consideration a lot of the exploration and production, a lot of the oil and gas development work is perhaps conducted outside of village remote areas. However, the locals that do live in the area are aware of the opportunities that come with exploration and any oil and gas activity in the region.
Mhm.
So that then is flowed down through their local policy. So we encourage local contractors and local subcontractors. It may just be a small SME, that is looking for work or looking for opportunities to participate and help assist. And you'll find that the integration model and the communication on the ground helps. So I do think a lot of local people that I know, that I've engaged with, that I've contracted with, have really just looked at an opportunity and said, okay, how can we get involved? And they've started the conversations. It's the local policy that supports them to set up the business, to start transactions. So really, a lot of emphasis has been put on SMEs locally.
Perfect. How the African countries are managing with the rest of the world in the energy sector.
I mean, the African continent in itself is. I went to the OPEC meeting. Let me start there
Mhm. Mhm.
in December in Vienna.
Mhm. Mhm.
I noticed that the African continent plays a critical role when discussing any energy sector and any energy concerns and matters. We mustn't lose sight that right now, like you've emphasized, and to reiterate, Nigeria is one of Africa's largest crude producers.
Mhm.
So, with great kind of acquisition and great responsibility in the oil and energy sector, I think a lot of emphasis has to be put on the level of exposure African continent and energy companies in Africa have on the global platform. And I think that there's a lot of concerns and issues right now because of the low oil price in Africa. And I believe that when you look at what's happened globally in the last 3 to 5 years, I think locally a lot of change has happened in the continent. For example, the recent transaction of the Harper Basin in Liberia, the big round and the actual exposure and the request for bid proposals, in fact, has been conducted. A lot of it has been conducted out of London. So I think the exposure on an international scale is something that we can benefit from as well.
Perfect. So, how can a national economy like Nigeria, Angola, Mozambique, Egypt that export crude oil and gas are not benefiting from low prices?
I think this is a tough question, but I also believe that the emphasis has been put on for these countries in particular so much on oil and gas, and perhaps at a time where the oil and gas price is so volatile, it's an opportunity for countries to look at diversifying their portfolios. I mean, with a low oil and gas price, there are also opportunities. The opportunities being for infrastructure and construction development as well. There are lots of contracts that perhaps are not kind of directly related to oil and gas exploration, but perhaps support the effort. And what that means is the construction ability and the infrastructure. For example, the development of the Dangote refinery in Nigeria. So, at a time when oil is such at a low price, one could question, why is the Dangote project moving forward? Again, there are lots of opportunities to now look at redevelopment work in the region. That's also energy related, but perhaps not the drilling or the actual operational side of things, but construction and infrastructure.
As someone who has been doing this for more than 10 years or 15 years, for many years, and you have knowledge about it, so what do you think so the African continent should do more to get much better in the sector?
I think the emphasis has to be put on education and youth employment and integration of a local content workforce. This is key. This is key for any emerging economy to consider. So we have to start considering graduate schemes for in-country locals. We have to start looking at our local content policies further. And I think we need to also understand that perhaps maybe the simple things that can support a larger scope. For example, I remember some students when I was working in Ghana really inquiring about how they can enter the region and their schoolwork and their university work. What courses do they take? And the truth is that one chap, I remember talking to him, and there was an online course, and I encouraged him. I said, look, you got to take a look at this online course. And then I later realized that the electricity goes in the middle of the night, so the poor kid was unable to go online. And it sounds like a silly story that we're engaging, but this is it's a true fact. It's relative to what's happening in that parts of the world. So yes, we have to support the local workforce and the younger generation coming up, but also how are they supposed to get access to these services and these facilities? So I think we as international companies currently are supporting on a CSR, corporate social responsibility level, a lot of encouragement of how we interact with the graduates and really the local workforce.
Perfect. Anything else would you like to add, or if someone want to contact you, how they will contact you?
So there's nothing further I'd like to add. I hope I've answered all the questions accurately. But by all means, if anyone would like to contact me for additional information, they can do. I've recently put up a personal portfolio website, which is www.rvknahar.com. I have an office based in London as well as Nigeria. So please feel free to drop me a line or send me an email, and I'm always active on LinkedIn as well.
Thank you so much for joining me this week on Africa View Deba.
Thank you so much. Pleasure.
Thank you.